This week we're going to do a prophecy update. And there's just a lot of things going on, a lot of things that I think are very significant that we need to be aware of. Now, a lot of you have heard about Common Core. Common Core is a new program that they have for schools that the government has put out. It has some things that I've seen that are just how they do math problems. Randy Hadley's head would explode if he saw how they... It already has exploded? Okay. Now we're just trying to pick up the pieces. And this just came out this week that Common Core has now, through the SAT, has partnered, that sets up the Common Core standards, with a group called China's state-run Confucius Institutes, which are known to mix cultural exchange with Communist Party propaganda as part of how they're going to be presenting things within Common Core and education to our students. I'm sure this is going to work out just fine. I'm confident there will be no fallout from this down the road, that we'll be putting our kids in with all this propaganda and that sort of thing from the Confucius Institutes. I'm sure that's going to work. This is an article. I'm sure a lot of you know about Bryan College down in Tennessee. It was founded, it's named after William Jennings Bryan, and was founded and named after Bryan after the Scopes monkey trial in Tennessee back in 1925. Clarence Darrow, which actually William Jennings Bryan won. There's a controversy going on right now within the campus where they wanted the faculty to sign a statement essentially reaffirming that Adam and Eve were historical people. A lot of science professors have left. There's been a big uproar on campus. The students are upset. Why is our administration being so dogmatic about this particular issue? It's a very important issue theologically. The professors don't want to affirm that Adam and Eve were historical figures. And this grows out of a thing that's been sweeping through evangelicalism over the last number of years called the Bio-Logos Project. And Bio-Logos is very, very weak on that particular issue. So I'm glad that the people at Bryan College are taking a stand, that the administration is taking a stand. I understand that something similar is going on at Cedarville, where they are trying to get the core theology of the institution back on track. And my understanding over at Cedarville, about 40% of the theology teachers, Bible and theology teachers, have left the institution. So there are some schools that are trying to get back on track. I don't want everybody to think that they're bad. So keep your eye on this thing down at Bryan College. In the last days, we talk about this verse a lot in 2 Peter, there will be scoffers, mockers, will come saying, where is the promise of his coming? For all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. Now that operates on a number of levels. I have said, I think here in the past, that I used to think that the scoffers and mockers would be people out in the world. Now I'm convinced, and we'll talk a little bit about this in a moment, that the scoffers and mockers are people actually within the evangelical church as they mock the teaching of Bible prophecy. Now here's one from the secular world. This is from the Rachel Maddow's show, a clip talking about this week about the Creation Museum. And I'll let you decide whether she's a mocker or not a mocker.
If you are a creationist, if you believe that God created the world in 6 days, and the Bible is a literal history, then fossils are an awkward thing for you. If the Bible is the literal truth of the creation of the earth and of everything that happened thereafter, then the earth is not very old. I mean, if taken literally, the Bible tells the story of an earth, a whole planet, that is at most maybe 7,000 years old. And so, if that's what you believe, fossils are an awkward thing, because fossils are the physical record of living things that died millions of years ago. But if you're a creationist, there is no such thing as millions of years ago. And so fossils are just this confounding thing. They mess up the whole story of the earth in 6 days, and then Adam and Eve, and the begatting, and the begatting, and the begatting, and then Jesus, and then us, right? That doesn't work if there's millions of years. It only works if there's a few thousand years. Creationists can't make sense of anything being more than a few thousand years old. It's a problem. And now it is maybe turning out to be a public policy problem. 4 years ago, in 2010, some creationists in Kentucky announced that they were going to build a Noah's Ark theme park, a giant physical representation of the Noah's Ark story from the Bible, as they believe it literally happened on Earth. And creationists do not believe that animals evolved slowly over millions of years. They think God created everything at the same time in that same week. And so everyone was together on Noah's boat, and that has to include dinosaurs. If there were ever dinosaurs on this earth, then those dinosaurs had to be there on the boat, with Noah and the snow leopards and the parrots and the emus and the ponies, all together, everybody on the boat. Humans and dinosaurs together. That said, the same group did just unveil a new marquee exhibit at their Creation Museum, which is just a few miles up the road. They say they will be showcasing at the Creation Museum a dinosaur, specifically an Allosaurus. An Allosaurus that they say appears to have died in Noah's flood. World, meet poor Ebenezer, who did not make the boat. He was reportedly found about 50% intact. The museum's displaying a skeleton made of his bones and also some castings to fill in for the bones they did not find. Ebenezer the Allosaur's new job at the Creation Museum is to show kids that evolution is not real, but the Noah's Ark story is real. And it turns out that Ebenezer comes with a kind of fossil record of his own that is almost as amazing as the history they are trying to invent for him at this museum in Kentucky. In May 2002, a group of fundamentalist Christian homeschoolers, they claimed that they dug him up. They dug up that dinosaur in Colorado after a last-minute prayer for help. At the time, this is how they announced that their dinosaur discovery in Colorado disproved the nutty idea that dinosaurs are millions of years old and actually proved the Bible version of the planet's history instead. Quote, the evidence strongly points to a relatively recent and catastrophic event similar to that described in the Bible as the flood of Noah's day. Not only, they say, was this fully articulated dinosaur found laying in a bed of leaves and plant debris, but there is wood from trees mixed in among the bones, some of which contains petrified and non-petrified elements in the same piece of wood. If this creature were millions of years old, the evidence would look quite different. It's amazing. They believe that dinosaurs must have died in the flood, and then they found a dinosaur that proves all dinosaurs died in the flood. They found this whole huge dinosaur laying there on a bed of leaves and plant debris. See, nothing is millions of years old. Ebenezer the dinosaur was so young, he was practically garden fresh. He was a dinosaur just taking a nap on a bed of leaves and plant debris, and they stumbled upon him. He was just right there.
Mocking or not mocking? Now listen, this is an example of Romans chapter 1 in action, where people lose the ability to reason. Now, I don't know which Ivy League school she went to. I'm pretty sure she went to an Ivy League school, because I've done my own experiment, by the way, my own observations, scientific observations, on my way to play golf on Saturday morning. One of the things that I'm amazed is the carnage along the road on my way to the golf course. Raccoons, little possums, rabbits, squirrels. It's just things getting killed all the time up there in Dublin. And I know that if something is killed and left out in the open, that in a day or two it gets run over a bunch more times, or birds pick at it, or other animals pick at it. There's not much left. The only way you get big fossils like this is rapid burial in some fashion. If they just died and fell over, you wouldn't be finding these massive, almost intact skeletons. There has to be a methodology for it. So maybe Rachel can come play golf with me sometime, and I'll explain to her the things about it. Now, there's an article by a guy named Jay Michelson. He writes for the Daily Beast. He is a left-winger. I don't know his sexual orientation. I I don't know if I should tell you to go read this article or not, where Christians write about gay marriage all along, because it's a little, I was talking to someone beforehand, if I presented to you the stuff in mainstream media and culture without editing it, you would fire me or tell me to leave, tell me to get out, because the details are so salacious and they're just awful to share with people. So I'm going to share with you some quotes from his article. He also wrote an article this week, you may have heard about it, where he says Kirk Cameron has changed his position on gay marriage. Now, this man is a leftist, which means that one of the first things you should assume is that he's probably lying and not telling the truth. And so what he's done is he's taken quotes of Kirk out of context to prove his point. So I don't think Kirk Cameron has changed his position. But this is typical of, lawyers do it, left-wingers do it. They pull stuff out of context, and this is proof of the point that I want to make. But it's an interesting article where he talks about the fact that the ultra-liberals on this issue of gay marriage or sexuality and the conservatives are actually maybe on the same page. And I'll read just a little bit what he says. Same-sex marriage is becoming a national inevitability. I think there were a number of court opinions yet again this week. I believe that the Republicans have essentially now thrown in the towel on the issue. Scott Walker, the governor in Pennsylvania, have said that they're not going to be appealing the rulings that struck down those states' marriage decisions. Same-sex marriage is becoming a national inevitability. This is Jay Michelson's article. A cascade of court opinions, significant public support, not to mention increasingly sympathetic gay couples and increasingly implausible opposition. All these and more point to an emerging national consensus that gay marriage is actually a form of marriage. It's not exactly clear when the hump took place, but we definitely seem to be over it. Which leads us to a perfectly logical question: what's next? He says this, radical. Now, I appreciate some of his honesty here, because all the people that support traditional marriage have said, if you open the door, we don't know what's going to happen. And now we see what's happening, okay? And at least some people that are ultra-liberal, left-wing, are saying, okay, yeah, maybe we need to look at what's next. Because, we don't really have a rational basis for barring any kind of living arrangements that people want to have. Radical traditionalists, he says, aren't the only ones fearing the consequences of same-sex marriage. So it may surprise you to learn, are radical progressives. Notice, by the way, that the ultra-conservatives and the radical liberationists share the same vision of LGBT liberation. Whether as a dream or nightmare, both see it as destroying conventional notions of church and state. The only question is whether same-sex marriage will speed or slow the process. And, of course, whether it's for better or worse. But I do like the notion of same-sex marriage as a liberation gateway drug, inclusion of LGBT people within the institutions like marriage, will eventually transform those institutions, just as including women, non-whites, non-Anglos, and non-Christians has done. The experiences and perspectives of LGBT people are different from those of straight people, and different in a good way. So if I had to predict, I'd go with a gradual realization of the conservative nightmare, only it won't be a nightmare, and plenty of straight people will thank us for it. Maybe gays will preserve marriage precisely by redefining, expanding, and reforming it, and maybe then it can be palatable to progressives as one of a multitude of options. In other words, he says, why should you be restricted to just one man or one woman? Why not have multiple living arrangements? And I don't remember the newspaper, I saw it in this week where they talked about the fact that, everything goes. Everything goes. And this was a mainstream publication. So this is what's coming. Now, when people oppose opening the marriage, letting the genie out of the bottle, so to speak, traditionalists said this is going to be a problem. And now I appreciate that even an ultra-liberal left-wing guy is saying, yeah, your nightmare is going to come true. And good, that's great. We're happy about that. So you haven't seen anything yet. This is the new Time magazine, and it's talking about the fact that there is going to be the next America's next civil rights frontier, the transgender tipping point. Now, I had a conversation with someone the other day about marriage. He said, I don't want anybody telling me or my kid who to marry, who they can marry or not. Now, if I had seen this before, I would say, so this would be okay for your little daughter to marry? You're going to be okay with this? This stuff is coming in like a flood, and I don't think at this point we've passed the tipping point. And absent a revival or God's grace, it's not going to get any different. It's only going to get, I'm afraid, worse, much worse. So you need to be aware of it. Let's look at geopolitics. Now, there is a lot of people in the prophecy community that still teach we're going to have a revived Roman Empire. Europe's going to unify. That's the final beast empire. That's where the Antichrist will come from. And it's possible, that is possible that it might happen. But you need to know they had elections this week, and ultra-left and what they call far-right parties really made some significant inroads. And this lady, her name is Marine Le Pen. Her goal is to dismantle the EU. So I think that development within the context of everything going on seems to indicate that maybe the revived Roman Empire is not the final beast empire of Bible prophecy. It could change. I'm just saying, I'm looking at it right now today. Europe is falling apart. The EU is falling apart. And the people on the right and the left that oppose the EU are making inroads because it just hasn't worked. People are pragmatists, and they're voting that way. So watch what's going on in Europe. Now I know this is always painful to talk. This is from the commentary, conservative publication, Jewish-oriented. Obama's Middle East, he's made it worse. Not everybody agrees with this. Fareed Zakaria, who is with CNN, writing an op-ed in the Investors Business Daily, said this just the other day. Foreign policy, talking about Obama, that even Ike would respect. Look at what he says. I don't know where these people spend their time, but they're not looking at the same stuff I am. But the world today looks very different, far more peaceful and stable than at any point in decades, and by some measures in centuries. The U.S. faces no enemy anywhere on the scale of Soviet Russia. America's military spending is about that of the next 14 countries combined, most of which are treaty allies of Washington. The number of democracies has grown by over 50% in the last quarter century. Okay. Fareed Zakaria, that's the definition of an optimist. Okay. But optimists are not realists. It was also this week, Jen Psaki of the State Department said, the one thing I really appreciate about it, she actually said this, there's a video of it, you can watch it, and listen to the reaction of the reporters at the State Department. She said State Department spokesperson. And she said, you really don't realize that Obama has really not taken credit like he should for his foreign policy. Because it's so good, he's so humble that he hasn't taken all the good credit for it. Again, these people, they've lost their minds. Investors Business Daily said this, well, maybe Obama's auditioning for another job. He's campaigning for it. So watch and see. He's not gone yet. Investors Business Daily also reported about this meeting. This is, of course, Vladimir Putin with the leaders of Kazakhstan and Belarus. Now, those were part of the Soviet Union. This is Kazakhstan, a huge country in the southern part of the former Soviet Union. And, of course, Belarus is over here just to the north of Ukraine and to the south of the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which it appears that Putin has his eye on. They're about this country. Actually, I think I have a graphic for this. These countries are about 25%. You can see these numbers here. Estonia and Latvia are over 25% ethnic Russian. Kazakhstan is about 1/4 ethnic Russian. Putin is concerned. This is a graphic. Russia has always been subject to easy invasion. They don't have natural barriers. It's hard to attack the United States. You got big oceans. You got a big country to the north that's cold a lot of the time. No, it's not Michigan. It's Canada. Michigan is kind of like Canada. I don't know if they say A as much, but Russia is wide open. You know, we've talked about the geographics of this, that these invasions can come in across these plains very easily, and Russia has no natural defenses. So as a result, they're paranoid. So what you see Putin do now is consolidating his power to create buffer zones, bigger buffer zones. He's taken the Crimea Peninsula down here in the Black Sea. He's picked up a large chunk of Ukraine. He's got the Belarus guy in his pocket now. He's got the Kazakhstan guy in his pocket. And he's looking at those Baltic states. And who knows what will happen there. So that's Russia. Now Turkey, another player in the end times. It was only 1 year ago that Erdogan was under severe attack with protests going on all across Turkey. He now seems, with some elections that have taken place, to have consolidated his power. But it's an interesting thing, geopolitics, because they had that big mine disaster recently where a bunch of 200-300 miners were killed. That's the kind of thing that can really bring down a government if people get angry enough about it. But he seems to be, he was able to say, I saw a video of him at that, when the mine thing was going on and people were yelling at him. He said, it was a Zionist plot. It was the Jews' fault. So that got him a lot of leverage with the rest of the people in the country. So it appears that he's moving on. There's some things that are doing. This is a prayer service that just took place in Istanbul at the Hagia Sophia, which was at one time the largest church in the world. It's now a museum. And what are they praying for? They're praying that Allah will turn it back into a mosque. This large building. One of the largest domes of antiquity. Now, Erdogan has also done some things where, and this might have some prophetic significance. We know that it talks about the Euphrates, in Revelation, about the Euphrates being dried up. He's drying up the Euphrates. There's big dams in Turkey. They're not releasing water. And so now Turkey and Iraq are having severe water shortage problems. There are some places in Syria, as if things weren't bad enough in Syria, now they have no water to drink in a lot of places. A huge problem. But I think this is Erdogan sort of asserting his power. And there are people who believe, and there are good thinking geopolitical consultants and things that say, we didn't have this problem in the Middle East when the Ottoman Empire was in control. Now, some prophecy teachers teach that the Ottoman Empire will be reconstituted as the final beast empire of prophecy that you read about in Revelation 17. So there are a number of different views, and a number of them are in play. I think we just need to be in the Word studying and looking at the facts of what's going on geopolitically. But the Euphrates is being severely dried up, and it goes through the heartland of Syria, comes in a little bit to the north, east of Aleppo, and comes right down through the center of the country. But it's where Syria's breadbasket is and where they get a lot of their water. So let's look at Syria for just a moment. We're going to look at Syria, then we're going to look at, I think, a significant event that happened a long time ago and then one this week. Syria. We know that most of the fighting in Syria has been in the western part of Syria. Damascus here in the south. Dara is down here where it started. Aleppo, the largest city, is in the north. Homs is right here. So most of the fighting has been in this region because this is pretty much wide open desert. The couple articles this week, one in the Times of Israel and one in the Financial Times, as Lebanon and Syria become one. I think that does have some prophetic significance, that because we know that there's a king of the north that's talked about in Daniel. And then Financial Times, Middle East, 3 nations, 1 conflict. And Financial Times said this: the various conflicts in Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon are increasingly merging into one war, stretching from the Zagros Mountains to the Mediterranean Sea, in what the writer Rami Khoury calls a single operational arena in terms of the ease of movement of fighters and weapons. That was just a few days ago. So has Assad won in Syria? Now, this region that they're talking about, the Zagros Mountains here, of Persian Gulf up into Iran, this region now is in major conflict. Iraq is falling apart. There's really a civil war going on there. The Kurds aren't too happy. You have Syria and Lebanon. You have Hezbollah moving things in along the Syrian border, threatening Israel. The Times of Israel article says this: the active involvement of Hezbollah in the fighting in Syria shattered the familiar rules of the game in Lebanon. Until then, the Syrians played on the Lebanese field. Now Hezbollah has become the defender of Assad, his rock, and his salvation. The fighting in Syria and Lebanon has become a religious war unconnected to country. Shiites against Sunnis, as if nothing has changed since the second half of the 7th century. The decision to fight in Syria had dramatic ramification for Hezbollah's political and public standing in Lebanon. If there were doubts about the Shiite organization's loyalties before, it became clear that Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, takes his marching orders from the Iranian regime, which is directing Assad's fight for survival. Following the conquest of Qusar and the mopping up of Yabrud, both close to the border with Lebanon, Hezbollah fighters are operating near Dara, that's in southern Syria near the Israeli border in the Golan Heights, on the Jordanian border. The Syrian regime is focusing efforts there in an attempt to regain control of the area and over the Syrian Golan Heights. And my understanding is that a couple weeks ago, Israel shut down people's access to certain parts of the Golan Heights because of the buildup of troops and that sort of things there. So that's an interesting thing to watch. Again, these countries that are in Bible prophecies, Syria, Turkey, Russia, the Middle East is a very significant thing. And it's contrary to what Fareed Zakaria says, I don't think things are better than they've ever been in centuries. I think things are getting a little bit dicey. Now, I want to talk about something. I've mentioned this magazine before. Cameron Strang is the publisher, Relevant Magazine. And it's supposedly targeted to millennials. Those are people that are younger than most of people like my age. It would be people in their 20s and early 30s. And this magazine, I showed you a copy of it a couple months ago. They have this tendency to mock the teaching of Bible prophecy. They're directed, they say 2 million young people read this every week. It has like this new issue has 43% of millennials say religious life is important. 68% say they have never doubted God's existence. 18% attend religious service on a weekly basis. There's a disconnect between those two numbers, a severe disconnect. And then 6 out of 10 walk away from faith of the church within the first decade of adult life. And we've known that that's been going on for a long time. Now, it's interesting. There's an ad that Relevant has for itself in there, embrace what's next. But my question is, do they really embrace what's next? The Bible's very clear about all the things that are coming up as to what's next. But they don't seem to celebrate that. There's a little blurb this week on their blog about the new Left Behind movie. Now, I don't know if this movie is any good. I don't know if it's hokey. I don't know. But listen to the tone of the blog post from the publisher of Relevant. It's been a little while since we've had any news to report on our generation's defining moment, the release of Nicolas Cage's Left Behind reboot. The film's inner machinations have been shrouded in mystery, far from the public eye, perfecting every point of the story in much the same way Michelangelo perfected every point of the Sistine Chapel. But today, at long last, we have 2 huge pieces of news to report. Finally, the poster. When you stare into Nicolas Cage's Left Behind poster, Nicolas Cage's Left Behind poster stares back at you. One can only guess at what feats of theatrical prowess burn in Cage's brow, but it's just as well we don't know. Mortal minds are not meant for such wizardry. Folks, that's mocking Bible prophecy. Whether you agree with the Left Behind series or not, or whether it was done well, or whatever, these people don't take seriously the return of the Lord. And my friend Jim Fletcher has a good article this week. They support the Palestinians in whatever it is they're trying to do to Israel. Now, I'm going to play you a video. There was supposedly disturbance in the West Bank, and it is claimed that Israel fatally shot 2 young Palestinians. I think you may have seen the stories. I have the video, okay? Now, normally I would say this is a shooting. It's going to be gory. It's going to be bloody. You don't need to worry about that, okay? Watch what happens. You'll see 2 men walking, and then they fall down because supposedly they've been shot. Okay, here we see one guy who's going to come in here from the left. There he is walking, shot. Oh, yep, caught myself. Now, does that look real? Okay, now they all go away. And here comes the next victim. He'll be walking. Oh, here he comes. It's kind of hard to see. Here he is right here. Oh, shot. Oh, catches himself again. Now, people went and took pictures of where they were laying. One was supposedly shot in the abdomen, the other in the back and fatally injured. What was there not on the pavement? No blood. These people are liars, folks. And this evangelical love affair with these lying people is troubling. So, I say this every week. So if you're in a church that's in mysticism, you're in a church that mocks Bible prophecy, you're in a church that supports this nonsense, you need to get out of that place because that place is no good. They're wrong on too many things. So here's a couple screen captures. This is the guy falling. This one won't show up because of the light in here. But you'll see he put his hands down and then he kind of knelt down and then he fell down. I don't think people shot in the back do that. And there's some high resolution photos that show that the one guy fell forward because he was shot in the leg with a rubber bullet. There were burning tires and there was a big disturbance there. Jerusalem Day, 47 years ago, these campaigns took place in Sinai and Judea and Samaria and in the Golan Heights. And Israel took back the city of Jerusalem. I'm going to play about a 10-minute clip of a documentary.
For close to 20 years, Jerusalem has been a city divided between Jordan and Israel. On the second day of the war, with the Sinai campaign going well, Moshe Dayan pulls out his paratroopers from the Egyptian front and sends them to fight in the battle for Jerusalem. Israelis are haunted by the loss of the Jewish quarter in the Old City just 19 years earlier in the 48 war. The quarter was destroyed, its synagogues defiled, and access to the Wailing Wall lost. Jews were exiled from a city where they had lived since the reign of King David 3,000 years before. To many Israelis, this was a national disaster. One of the paratroopers sent from the Sinai to fight in Jerusalem is Hanan Porat.
For me, and not only for me, I finally understood something. The war was changing direction. It was no longer a war for survival, a defensive war against jihad, but a war which, even if we didn't express it this way, had become a war of redemption. I remember how we went up to Jerusalem in these dusty buses. The bus is roaring with the song, Jerusalem of Gold. The guys are singing about how the water holes have dried up, how nobody comes anymore to visit the town square. I mean, who thought about those things back then?
The song, Jerusalem of Gold, was written just before the war. It's an unlikely anthem for the soldiers, most of them secular Jews who have always regarded Tel Aviv as their center. But the war is changing Israel. The largely secular nation is getting a heady dose of religion, and the battle for Jerusalem is starting to feel like another holy war. That night, the Israelis begin a determined ground offensive. The soldiers are paratroopers, like Private Yaki Hetz, fighting for the ridge overlooking the old city.
I felt there was no earth underneath me, like I'm walking through water. I shoot just to get my confidence back.
Ghazi Rubaya commands a company of the Jordanian army assigned to protect the ridge.
I had two options. Either my soldiers get killed, or I find a way out of here. What shall I do? The Jews are coming from all sides. The spirit of my soldiers is at its lowest.
The Jordanian resistance is broken after 5 hours of fierce fighting. 105 Jordanians and 35 Israelis die, 18 of them from Yaki Hetz's platoon.
I was in shock. I tried to understand what happened. For me, it was a war of survival. I never took part in any of the celebrations. Even a year later, I couldn't listen to the music that celebrated the victory. I refused to listen to Jerusalem of Gold. I had to turn the radio off. I was in despair. This war was a terrible blow.
Those who listen to my story of the war may not realize the scope of the tragedy, the fierceness of the battle, the fear, the hunger, the pain, the responsibility. Defeat is bitter. Its psychological effects stayed with us for a very long time.
With the defeat of the Jordanians who were defending the approaches to the city, the Israelis prepare to move in. Abdullah Schleifer is there to witness the beginning of the fall of the old city.
I saw one airplane that swept low, clearing the Dome of the Rock, and then as it moved upward, it dropped the bombs that wiped out the last Jordanian military positions that were defending the approach to the old city.
By morning, most of the Jordanian defenders in Old Jerusalem are gone.
On the third day, about 600 or 700 people came to us in the Aqsa Mosque, asking us to withdraw. I don't blame them. They saw tanks in the streets, and they were under the influence of Israel's psychological warfare.
A few stayed on the walls to fight. A few militiamen and a few Jordanian soldiers who decided they were going to stay and die here. They stayed on the walls, and there was even a unit, a sergeant and two of his men, who were with the Jordanian army as it left the city. And by the time it got to the other side of the valley, they looked back, the sun was rising, and they saw the sun sparkling on the dome. And they were so moved by this sight. Usually when people desert, they desert to go away from war. These men deserted to come back and fight.
We arrived here late in the morning. We came down from Augusta Victoria through the Kidron Valley and climbed towards the Lion's Gate. We felt that we were making history, that we were writing a new chapter in the Bible.
Suddenly I heard tremendous shouts, and I realized that the Israelis had entered the city. You know, tremendous shouts of victory and exultation and firing. You could see Israeli troops fanning out in the Haram Sharif, and you could see the prisoners were being taken, and they were obviously notables of the city, because this Haram was the last command post for the governor, for what there was of a civilian command.
From the Temple Mount, the soldiers find a small gate that leads to the Wailing Wall. Even young secular Israelis get caught up in the religious frenzy.
Near me, I can see a kibbutz member from a left-wing kibbutz, and he is asking me, Hanan, what prayer do you say here? I tell him, pray. But I do not know how to pray, he answers. Say Shema Israel. And he tells me, I do not know how to say it. I told him, repeat after me. And he repeated, shouting, Shema, listen, our God of Israel. Believe me, I do not know if I ever heard such a prayer in my life.
I'm standing there with my family holding my American passport, and I'm saying, I'm an American, I'm an American. And they're shouting, the roof, the roof. in English. They want to get out of the roof because there's still some sniping. And then it's in every Israeli history book. They come up to hang the flag.
Israeli soldiers capture the euphoric moment on home movie cameras. The Israelis have taken the old city of Jerusalem. They have, in their view, liberated one of Judaism's holiest sites, the remains of the Second Temple. But at the same time, they have occupied one of the Muslim world's holiest places, the Haram al-Sharif, or Noble Sanctuary. This tragic intersection of religious geography will stoke the fires of conflict for generations to come. And it will be a deep and humiliating setback for Jordan's king.
King Hussein has always perceived himself as a Hashemite leader. He's a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. And the protection of the Jerusalem Muslim shrines was the responsibility of the Hashemites. And history would register that they were lost during his time.
If we are going to live, we will live with honor. If we don't make it, we will die with honor. For our nation, for our rights, and for all times.
The conquering generals of the Israeli army, Moshe Dayan, Uzi Narkis, and Yitzhak Rabin, proudly enter the city they've captured. They are careful to record the moment.
We advanced about 10 meters past the gate when Dayan stopped the group and said, "Ilan, please go forward and take a picture of me entering the old city." These were his exact words.
It is to be a purely military triumph. Israeli Prime Minister Levi Eshkol is absent. He has been told it's too dangerous for him to come. There's only room for Israel's heroes of the moment, the military. For the Arab armies, the war has been one defeat after another. If their leaders are to survive this calamity, they must shift the blame somewhere else. Egyptian President Gamal Nasser gets on the phone with Jordan's King Hussein. Together, they come up with an explanation for their defeats. They accuse the US and Britain of fighting on Israel's side. But Israeli intelligence has taped the call. When U.S. diplomat Richard Parker hears the accusation over the radio, he calls Nasser's deputy.
I called up and said, "What the hell is this? There aren't any American aircraft within 300 miles of Egypt." He said, "For your information, they could not possibly have done what they did without help, and that help had to come from you or the British. And we think it was you."
The accusation about U.S. and British involvement ricochets around the Arab world and feeds a growing resentment against the West. From the outset, President Johnson has tried to stop the fighting. He also wants a post-war policy that would bring a more lasting peace. But first, he has to get the UN Security Council on board.
A normal United Nations Security Council resolution in a situation like this after a war or an attack would be ceasefire and withdrawal of forces to their pre-war boundaries.
The Soviets want a ceasefire and a withdrawal. But Johnson accepts Israel's argument that they should not withdraw and that the captured territories be exchanged for peace. In the corridors of the UN, intense negotiations take place. The Soviet Union is so alarmed at the speed of Arab losses that it's ready to accept a quick agreement and avoid the complete destruction of the Arab armies. The Soviets, therefore, agree to a ceasefire with no withdrawal, even though Israel is now in possession of large swaths of Arab land. To Johnson's dismay, Egypt and Syria refuse to accept the proposal. But this principle of exchanging land for peace becomes the American policy in the Arab-Israeli conflict.
Nobody sat down and said the position of the United States for the next 40 years will be no Israeli withdrawal until there's peace. We're still, 40 years later, dealing with the consequences of that decision.
I had a conversation with someone online this week about what happened back in 1967 in evangelical churches in America. And we kind of estimated that out of 100 pastors back in those days, you might have had 15, 20, 25, maybe even 30 that talked about it within the next week because it was such a significant event that had taken place. And then I asked the question, how many pastors this week will talk about the visit of the Pope?
Pope Francis today invited Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas and Israeli President Shimon Peres to the Vatican next month to pray for peace. Both accepted. It happened during the second day of the Pope's Middle East trip, spent largely in the Palestinian territories. Alan Pizzi has more.
The papal visit was a massive boost for the Palestinians' claim to statehood. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Pope said, was increasingly unacceptable, but he wasn't taking sides in it. The time has come, Francis went on, for everyone to find the courage to be generous and creative in the service of the common good. In an unscheduled stop, he left his Popemobile to utter a prayer at the massive wall Israel has built for security and which Palestinians complain cuts up their land. Then at a Mass in Bethlehem's Manger Square, the Pope sprang another surprise, an invitation to Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas and his Israeli counterpart Shimon Peres to come to my house in the Vatican to pray together for peace. Both accepted. Francis later visited with children from a nearby refugee camp and heard their tales of hardship. The camp where they come from sums up why the peace process seems endless. This mural lists 56 villages from where the refugees were expelled. 74-year-old spinach seller Yusra Ismail came here as a child. Her dream of going back to her village is one instilled into every generation here. The Israeli leaders who welcome Francis insist it's never going to come true, but they too got a diplomatic shove. The two-state solution must become a reality, the Pope said, and not remain merely a dream. And the spirit of reconciliation was at the heart of Francis' visit to Jerusalem, when he prayed with the Orthodox Patriarch in the tomb where Christ was buried. Tomorrow, the Pope will visit the Holocaust Memorial, hold meetings with Israel's top leaders, and Mass at the Room of the Last Supper, and then head home. Mission accomplished for now. Jeff?
Alan Pizzi, thank you.
He started his trip in Jordan. He went to the site, the traditional site where Jesus was baptized. He met with the Jordanian government, King Hussein. He also, this is one of the meeting places that he had in Jordan. He then took a helicopter over to near Bethlehem, where he met with Mahmoud Abbas. Of course, he rode around in his bulletproof Popemobile. Mass that he celebrated in Manger Square. I know many of you have been there. They erected an altar. And he and the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem spoke. He later went to the Wailing Wall. He then went to the Yad Vashem and did this. Caroline Glick had this to say. Her title of her article is, Pope Francis' unfriendly visit. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Foreign Minister Avigdor Lieberman were right when they blamed the noxious anti-Israel incitement rampant in Europe for Saturday's murderous shooting at the Jewish Museum in Brussels and the assault and battery of two Jewish brothers outside their synagogue in a Paris suburb later that day. Anti-Israel incitement is ubiquitous in Europe and is appearing in ever-widening circles of the Western world as a whole. She talked a little bit. I think her historical analysis was probably a little bit superficial, that things were pretty good under Pope Benedict and John Paul II. But she said this: alas, the golden age of Catholic-Jewish relations seems to have come to an end during Francis' visit to the Promised Land this week. In one of his blander pronouncements during the papal visit, Netanyahu mentioned on Monday that Jesus spoke Hebrew. There was nothing incorrect about Netanyahu's statement. Jesus was, after all, an Israeli Jew, but Francis couldn't take the truth. So he indelicately interrupted his host, interjecting Aramaic. Here's the exchange. Now, I'm sure this is not the exchange. This is the greeting. Nice handshake, right? How did he greet Mahmoud Abbas? A Palestinian terrorist dedicated to the annihilation of the Jewish people gets a hug from the Pope. This is a prophetic significant event, prophetically significant. It shows the world coming together against Israel and with murderous people. We're waiting for a world leader to emerge to kind of bring all this together. So when I talked to my friend, maybe 47 years ago, 30 out of 100 pastors would have talked about the prophetically significant event. I said, I doubt that 3 out of 1,000 will this week. And he said, John, you are being very, very generous with that estimate. This was a significant meeting. Here is the exchange between Netanyahu in Hebrew and the Pope in Spanish. But you'll be able to pick up the words. Yeshua. What he's saying is Jesus knew Hebrew, and he spoke in Hebrew. Caroline Glick says, Netanyahu was probably flustered. True, at the time, educated Jews spoke and wrote in Aramaic, and Jesus was educated, but the language of the people was Hebrew, and Jesus preached to the people in Hebrew. Netanyahu responded he spoke Aramaic, but he knew Hebrew. Reuters' write-up of the incident tried to explain away the Pope's rudeness and historical revisionism, asserting modern-day discourse about Jesus is complicated and often political. I really do like the way she writes. The report went on to delicately mention Palestinians sometimes describe Jesus as a Palestinian. Israelis object to that. Israelis object to that because it is a lie. The Palestinians and their Islamic and Western supporters de-Judaize Jesus and proclaim him Palestinian in order to libel the Jews and criminalize the Jewish state. It seems like it would be the job of the Bishop of Rome to set the record straight, but instead Francis' discourtesy indicated that at a minimum, he doesn't think that the fact of Jesus' Judaism should be mentioned in polite company. And then he went to the wall. And look at what's on this wall. Bethlehem, look, and there's a statement here. Now, listen, there's some dispute. This was a spontaneous thing that Francis did. He's just so happened, there's pictures of people spray painting a message to the Pope at the place where he just happened to decide to stop. There's a Palestinian pamphlet that was distributed to the media that showed where he was going to stop. So this was not instantaneous. That's a bunch of scubalon. One wag said this was in the Calgary Herald, a great editorial cartoon. The Pope, why this wall in Israel? Netanyahu, why this bulletproof glass in Popemobile? Good point. Caroline, consider first Francis' behavior at the security bureau. Reasonable people disagree about the contribution the security fence makes to the security of Israelis, but no one can reasonably doubt that it was built to protect Israelis from Palestinian terrorist murders. That's exactly why it's high in some places and not in others, to prevent sniper fire. And Francis ought to know this. Francis' decision to hold a photo op at the security bureau was an act of extreme hostility against Israel and the Jewish people. And she goes on to tell the story about 11 years ago, 5 people murdered by a Palestinian terrorist with the support of Fatah up in the northern part of Israel, along where the security barrier is in a kibbutz. At the time, she notes, Fatah praised the attack and on its website and pledged to conduct more assaults on Zionist colonizers and promised to continue targeting their children as well. She continues about the Pope. Had he actually cared about the cause of peace and nonviolence he claims to champion, Francis might have averred from stopping at the barrier, recognizing that doing so would defile the memory of the Ohioans and of hundreds of other Israeli Jewish families who were destroyed by Palestinian bloodlust and anti-Semitic depravity. Instead, Francis spontaneously got out of his Popemobile, walked over to a section of the barrier, and reverentially touched it and kissed it as if it were the Wailing Wall. The graffiti on the section of the barrier Francis stopped at reinforced his anti-Semitic position. One of the slogans called for the embrace of the BDS campaign. That is nothing compared to the other slogan on the barrier, the one that equated the Palestinians in Bethlehem to Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto. In other words, it denied the Holocaust. By standing there, kissing the barrier with its Holocaust-denying slogan, Francis gave Vatican license to Holocaust denial. I agree. And this is what it says on the stage. Bethlehem looked like Warsaw Ghetto. That is where he stopped. That is where he put his hand on the wall. That is where he kissed the wall reverentially. Pope Francis then met with Fatah Chief Mahmoud Abbas at his presidential palace in Bethlehem. She goes on to talk about the fact that that used to be a Greek Orthodox church, but Arafat seized it. Now it's just the official residence of the Palestinian government. Abbas returned the favor by calling for Israel to release all Palestinian terrorists from Israeli prisons. And the Pope, who interrupted Netanyahu when he told an historic truth, said nothing. Nothing. And here's the meeting in the presidential palace. Now, the Latin patriarch had this to say at the Mass in Manger Square. Together with you, most holy Father, today we beg the child Jesus to expand his grotto to welcome and accommodate the many children who are victims of violence and injustice. How can we forget to pray for the many prisoners in overcrowded prisons? They hunger for a piece of bread, yearn for justice and peace, destitute for a welcoming home. We are not yet done with the present-day Herods. This was said at a religious service, this blood libel lie, who fear peace more than war, who dread the prosperity of families, and who are prepared to continue killing. That's the Latin patriarch of the Orthodox Church from Jerusalem. He said this, we, the descendants of the first shepherds. How many lies can you pile up in a sermon? In response to the invitation of the angels, we are with you in Bethlehem to adore the child and to pay tribute to his parents. And at the altar there, behind him, there's this painting, a mural of the Mary, Joseph, and the child, and the 3 wise men. I guess they're the pre-incarnate Pope Paul VI, John Paul II, and Benedict the 16th. But look at this. This is blasphemous. Jesus was a Jew. Caroline Glick was right. Do you see what they have the baby wrapped in? One of those Palestinian scarves. Look at what Joseph has on. It's one of those Palestinian scarves. This is the people that Lynn Hybels and other evangelicals go to Israel, go to Bethlehem in Israel, go to Bethlehem and engage in that nonsense down there called the, what is that stupid thing called? The conference that they have, Checkpoint, yeah, Christ at the Checkpoint. They're rewriting history. They don't care about the Bible. They don't care about truth. This is people losing their ability to reason. This is what happens in the end times. The nun. Yeah, it's probably St. Teresa of Avila or something. She's probably taken a break from one of her mystical dreams or something. Brian Schrager in the Jerusalem Post on Thursday or Friday had a great article, Identity Theft in Bethlehem, showing what they've done with these different pictures depicting scenes from the life of Christ that they've turned into Palestinian propaganda. So there the Pope stood performing a mass in front of the Palestinian baby Jesus. Rather than condemn these remarks, Francis echoed them. So if they thought the Latin patriarch was wrong or bad, this is what Francis said. Who are we as we stand before the child Jesus? Who are we standing before today's children? Are we like Mary and Joseph who welcomed Jesus and cared for him with the love of a father and mother? Or are we like Herod who wanted to eliminate him? He continued the theme. During his visit Monday to Jerusalem, Francis embraced the Palestinian Mufti of Jerusalem, Sheikh Mohammed Hussein. Departing from his scripted remarks, which called for the Pope to refer to the Mufti and his associates as dear friends, Francis called them his dear brothers. Hussein has been condemned by the U.S. and EU for his calls for the annihilation of Jews in the name of Islam. In 2012, Hussein said it was the destiny of Muslims to kill Jews, who he claims are subhuman beasts and the enemies of Allah. He has also praised suicide bombers and said their souls tell us to follow their path. Francis didn't condemn him. Francis didn't correct him in the middle of a sentence. Francis stridently condemned the anti-Jewish attacks in Brussels and Paris. And during his ceremonial visits to Yad Vashem, the Wailing Wall, and the Terror Victims Memorial, he said similarly appropriate things, but all of his statements ring hollow and false in light of his actions. Israelis and Jews around the world need to be aware of what is happening. Francis is leading the Catholic Church in a distressingly anti-Jewish direction. I would disagree with her that he's reviving what's been there all along. And we have this video. I don't have time to go into it this week. We'll talk about it next week. This is the video of Pope Francis back in February talking giving a thing to Tony Palmer, an Anglican bishop, who I played his talk at Kenneth Copeland's Charismatic Evangelistic Association conference in Fort Worth back in February. The Reformation is over. It's time to bury all this. And next week I'll probably have some more things to share with you about what is planned from information that has been made available to us, what is planned for evangelicals and Catholics to come together and then to go to Jerusalem to celebrate it in the not-too-distant future. And I think you'll be stunned. You won't want to miss that. So I'm going to leave you hanging. Very significant time. So I know that at least one church talked about it today. Thank you for listening. I appreciate it. I dearly appreciate the opportunity to share this information with you. We live at a unique time of human history. Too many churches are unaware and never talk about it. And that breaks my heart. I remember my dad talking about it in '67 for weeks. You know, he didn't. You think I beat a dead horse? No, I'm just kidding. He talked about it a lot because it was significant, because it was from the Bible, and you could see the things unfolding around you. So that's all I have this week. Let's pray.